The sound of my tires crunching over the gravel road was the first indication that I had truly entered the wild. It was late in the afternoon when I finally arrived in Maine, the perfect time to start what had become an annual ritual, my solo hunting trip. For me, these trips were more than just about the hunt. They were a time for reflection, a chance to escape the noise and chaos of daily life and reconnect with a simpler, quieter world. As much as I enjoyed the company of family and friends, there was something about venturing alone into the wilderness that felt deeply fulfilling. There, in the stillness of nature, I found a peace that was difficult to explain, a kind of solitude that was not lonely, but deeply introspective. This trip was no different. I had rented a small, secluded cabin far away from the bustling towns and highways, a cabin that sat nestled against the backdrop of towering pines and dense forests. The place was remote, isolated, and quiet, a perfect escape from the constant hum of my busy life. The road leading to the cabin twisted and turned, cutting through the dense woods, narrowing until I was almost entirely surrounded by trees. As I drove deeper into the woods, the daylight began to fade, and with it, the sounds of civilization slowly disappeared. The only sound now was the rhythmic hum of my engine as I navigated the winding path, the world around me growing darker, more mysterious, and more alive with the unseen creatures of the night. I knew this was what I had come for, to be alone, to feel the hum of nature beneath my feet, and to immerse myself fully in the wilderness. I was no expert at hunting, not by a long shot, but it was never just about the deer or the moose for me. It was about something deeper, something intangible that I could only experience when I was out here, far from the distractions of everyday life. When I reached the cabin, the air had turned chilly, and the sky had deepened into a velvet purple, with stars already beginning to twinkle overhead. The sight of the cabin, standing strong and quiet amidst the darkened trees, gave me a sense of comfort, even though I was fully aware of how isolated I was. I parked my truck and stepped out into the cold, crisp air. The scent of pine and earth was rich, filling my lungs with every breath I took. As I approached the cabin, I could feel the stillness pressing against me like a heavy cloak. There was no one else around for miles, just me, the trees, and the vast, open sky above. I had rented the cabin from a local, and they had told me the key would be hidden under the doormat. Sure enough, it was there. I picked it up and unlocked the door, stepping inside. The warmth that greeted me was a relief after the cold night air, and I immediately felt a sense of calm wash over me. The cabin was small but cozy. The heat was already on, which was a thoughtful touch considering how cold it could get in November in Maine. There was something about the glow of the soft lighting and the quiet hum of the cabin that made it feel like home, despite being so far from anything familiar. After unpacking my things, I set my alarm for an early start. There was something magical about waking up before the world around you. The air felt fresher, the quiet more profound, and the possibilities for the day ahead seemed endless. I knew that dawn would bring the best chances of finding deer, or even a moose if I was lucky. But more than that, it brought the chance to experience the wilderness in its purest form, untouched and raw. It was the time when the world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the sun to rise and the day to begin. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of my alarm, the first light of day barely creeping over the horizon. I rolled out of bed quickly, eager to start the day. There was a certain stillness that only comes in the early hours, before the world begins to wake up. The air outside was crisp, and the faintest hint of fog clung to the ground, making the trees and the earth appear as though they were floating in a dream. I had a plan for where I wanted to go hunting, but that was never set in stone. In the wilderness, the plan was as fluid as the landscape itself. You never knew what you might find, and that was part of the thrill. I loaded my gear and walked out into the woods, the familiar crunch of the leaves beneath my boots, the only sound breaking the silence. I hadn't seen another soul since arriving, and that felt right. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy company, I did, but there was something about the solitude of the forest that made everything feel more meaningful. Out here, there were no distractions, no demands, no expectations. It was just me and nature, working in harmony. It was during these moments that I felt most connected to the earth, to the past, to the deep, unspoken bond that humans have with the natural world. I had settled behind a blowdown, a fallen tree that made a perfect barrier for concealment. From here, I could see the forest stretching out before me, the occasional flicker of movement catching my eye. There was something peaceful about the waiting game, about sitting in stillness and letting the world around you unfold. But as I sat there, something unexpected happened. From behind me, a voice called out. The sound shattered the silence, making my heart race and my stomach drop. I spun around, already on edge, and there, emerging from the shadows, was a man. He was older, with gray hair, but still strong-looking, no older than 50. He moved slowly, deliberately, with an air of authority that set my nerves on edge. His voice was sharp and cold when he spoke, demanding to know what I was doing there. For a moment, I was frozen, unsure of how to respond. Was this someone else hunting in the area? A park ranger? My mind raced, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. He told me that hunting was restricted in this area, a rule I hadn't been aware of. I explained that I didn't know about the restrictions, and that I was just here to enjoy the experience of being in nature. His eyes hardened, and he said something that sent a chill through me. I watched you right up here. I know what you're doing. His tone made it clear that he had no interest in my explanation. Instead, it felt like he had already decided who I was, and that decision was not a favorable one. He told me to leave, to go back the way I came. I was confused, but also deeply unsettled. The woods had always felt like a place of safety for me, a refuge from the world. But now, in the presence of this stranger, it suddenly felt much more dangerous, much more unpredictable. I apologized to him, not knowing what else to do, and gathered my things quickly. I could feel his eyes on my back as I walked away, but when I turned to look, he was gone, swallowed up by the trees. The encounter left me shaken, but I wasn't about to let it ruin my trip. I drove to another park that was open to hunting, determined to make the most of the day. But even as I walked the trails and searched for game, I couldn't shake the unease that lingered from the interaction. The man's words echoed in my mind, and the unsettling feeling that someone was watching me stayed with me, even as the hours passed and the sun climbed higher in the sky. By midday, I was exhausted, physically and mentally. The quiet of the wilderness had been replaced by the buzz of nervous energy, and the hunt had become less about the thrill and more about pushing through the tension that had settled in my chest. I headed back to the cabin to rest, to clear my mind, and to have a meal before I set out again. But when I returned, something felt off. The door to the cabin was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it when I left. A small, insignificant detail, but one that stirred an uncomfortable feeling in the pit of my stomach. I pushed the thought aside and tried to focus on the rest of the day. But the events of the morning and the strange, unnerving encounter kept replaying in my mind, like a loop I couldn't escape. I tried to shake it off, to focus on the hunt and the peaceful solitude I had come here to find. But the woods, it seemed, were no longer the comforting refuge I had once known. They had become a place of uncertainty, of mystery, and maybe even a little fear. And yet, despite everything, I knew I would keep coming back. The wilderness had its own rhythm, its own pace, and though it could be unsettling at times, it was also where I felt most alive. There was a certain beauty in the quiet, in the solitude, and in the mystery of what lay beyond the trees. It was a reminder that nature, while beautiful, is also unpredictable, wild, and often beyond our control. In that moment, I realized that the wilderness wasn't just a place to hunt. It was a place to learn, to grow, and to confront the parts of ourselves that we often avoid. And even though I was alone in the woods, I never truly felt lonely. The forest had a way of filling the spaces in my mind, offering peace in a way no other place could. There, surrounded by the sounds of the wind and the trees, I was reminded that I was part of something much bigger than myself. And that thought alone was enough to keep me coming back, year after year, to face the wild with both caution and wonder. There are moments in life when everything feels right, when the world around you is quiet, still, and exactly as it should be. The air is crisp, the sun is just beginning to rise, and the rhythm of your breath matches the heartbeat of the earth itself. I had always cherished these quiet mornings, especially when I ventured into the wilderness alone. It was on those mornings, surrounded by the sounds of rustling leaves and distant birdsong, that I felt the most connected to the world, like I was part of something larger than myself. I had made my way to Maine for another solo hunting trip, seeking a temporary escape from the complexities of life. My plan was simple: get up early, find a secluded spot, and settle into the calm of nature while waiting for the perfect shot. But, as I would soon learn, nature has a way of surprising you, especially when you least expect it. It was just before dawn, and the woods were still shrouded in that blue-gray light that always comes before the sun fully rises. I had parked my truck and set off on foot, carrying only the bare essentials: my rifle, a few snacks, and my hunting pack. The forest around me seemed alive with possibility. As I walked through the trees, I was mindful of every step I took. The soft crunch of leaves beneath my boots was the only sound breaking the profound silence. There was something deeply calming about the stillness, something that felt almost sacred. In these moments, I was reminded that the wilderness is not a place to conquer, but a place to be humbled by. After walking for a while, I found my spot, behind a blowdown, a massive fallen tree that provided perfect cover. The ground was uneven, and the leaves had a fresh layer of frost on them. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air as I crouched down and settled into my position. My eyes scanned the trees around me, searching for any sign of movement, any flicker of life that might be a deer or perhaps even a moose. Hunting, for me, was more about patience than skill. It was about waiting, about being present in the moment, and about letting nature reveal itself to you on its own terms. But on that morning, the woods held more than just the promise of a quiet hunting trip. As I sat there, my focus was interrupted by something I couldn't quite place, a feeling, almost like a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you might dismiss if you weren't paying attention. But then it grew, the feeling intensifying, the air around me suddenly feeling heavier. I looked around, but the trees were still, the wind barely stirring the branches above me. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, yet something in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. It was a quiet warning, a whisper of instinct, telling me that I was not as alone as I thought I was. I tried to shake it off, pushing the nagging feeling to the back of my mind. I had been hunting in these woods for years, and I had never had anything happen to make me question my safety. But there was something about that morning that felt different, something I couldn't quite put into words. It was almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then I heard it. A sound, no louder than the rustling of leaves, but distinct and unmistakable. It wasn't an animal, though. It wasn't the sound of a deer moving through the underbrush or a bird taking flight. No, this was the sound of something deliberate, something that was making its way toward me. My heart skipped a beat as I turned my head toward the direction of the noise, but I couldn't see anything through the trees. The shadows were deep, and the faint light of dawn had not yet fully illuminated the woods. I froze, my senses on high alert. For a moment, everything else faded away. The cold air, the damp earth beneath me, the weight of my rifle in my hands. All I could focus on was the sound, now growing louder, closer. My breath quickened as I tried to listen more closely, trying to discern what or who it was. The sound of footsteps, perhaps, but not animal footsteps. There was something deliberate about it, something human. I should have been more cautious. I should have stayed hidden and observed from a safe distance. But the curiosity in me pushed me to rise slowly, silently, to my feet. I moved just enough to peek around the side of the blowdown, my eyes searching the woods for any sign of movement. It was then that I saw him, a figure, emerging from the trees like a shadow. At first, I thought it might be another hunter. It wasn't unusual for people to be out here, especially during the season. But something about this figure didn't feel right. He was moving slowly, almost as if he were deliberately trying to stay out of sight, but the way he walked was peculiar, unnatural even. He didn't seem to be walking with purpose, but rather like he was drifting through the trees, almost blending into the shadows themselves. My heart began to race as I watched him approach. He wasn't making any effort to conceal himself now. He was coming closer, moving toward the very spot where I was hiding. His clothes were dark, blending with the forest around him, but there was something about his demeanor that sent a chill down my spine. His movements were slow, deliberate, but there was no sound, no crunch of leaves, no shifting of branches, just the soft rustle of the wind as it moved through the trees and the eerie quiet that surrounded us. I felt a surge of panic rise in me, though I tried to keep it under control. I hadn't expected this. I hadn't expected to feel this level of fear on a hunting trip. It wasn't the kind of fear that comes with tracking an animal or the quiet anticipation of the hunt. No, this was something different, something primal, a sense that something wasn't right. And yet there I was, unsure of how to react. Should I call out? Should I confront him? Or should I stay hidden and wait for him to pass? My hand instinctively reached for my rifle, but I didn't raise it. Not yet. I knew that the way I acted in the next few moments could determine the outcome of this encounter. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to make sense of what was happening. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, the adrenaline beginning to course through my veins. Every part of me wanted to stay hidden, to remain silent, and to figure out what this man, if it was a man, was doing here. He was getting closer now. I could see his face, pale and gaunt, framed by the darkness of the forest around him. There was an unsettling emptiness in his eyes, a kind of coldness that made me question everything I had assumed about being alone in the woods. He wasn't just a stranger. He was someone who didn't belong here, someone who didn't respect the woods the way I did. As he came closer, I knew I had to make a decision. My instincts told me to move, to get out of sight, but there was something inside me that wanted to understand what was happening. I waited, watching him closely, trying to assess his intentions. But before I could react, he spoke. "What are you doing here?" His voice was low and sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of me as a fellow hunter, just an accusation in his tone. I was taken aback, not sure how to respond. "I'm just hunting," I said, my voice steady despite the unease gnawing at me. I didn't know this area was restricted. He didn't seem to care about my explanation. Instead, he just stood there, watching me, his eyes narrowing with something that looked like contempt. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his words dripping with something dark. "This place isn't for you." I felt a rush of confusion. Was he a park ranger? Someone who lived nearby? What did he mean by, "This place isn't for you"? But before I could ask any more questions, he took a step forward, closing the distance between us, his presence growing more threatening with every movement. Something inside me snapped. I couldn't just stand there anymore, couldn't let him come any closer. I had to act, to get away. I turned on my heel and began walking quickly, almost running, but my mind was reeling. Why had he been watching me? What did he mean by those words? Was I in danger? I didn't look back. Instead, I retraced my steps, making my way back to my truck as quickly as I could, my heart still pounding in my chest. The air around me felt heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even as I made my way out of the woods. I didn't know who that man was or what his intentions had been, but one thing was clear: I would never look at the woods the same way again. The wilderness, once a place of comfort and peace, had shown me a side of itself that I hadn't been prepared for. It wasn't just the trees, the animals, and the quiet. It was a place where the unknown could find you, even when you thought you were alone. And sometimes it was the shadows in the woods that were the most dangerous things of all. The return to the cabin should have been a moment of relief. It had been a long, tense morning, and the woods had felt heavy with unease. What should have been a peaceful hunting trip had shifted into something darker, a series of events that gnawed at my sense of safety. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees had become unnerving instead of calming. The woods, which had always felt like a refuge, now seemed like a place where shadows lurked, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true form. And when I turned the corner and saw the familiar outline of the cabin in the distance, it was supposed to feel like home, a place of rest after the chaos of the wild. But it didn't. The air was thick with silence as I drove the truck down the winding dirt road, the tires kicking up dust and gravel in the stillness. Everything was so quiet, it almost felt oppressive. The world around me felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something I couldn't predict. My mind kept drifting back to the strange encounter in the woods with the man. His eyes, cold and unnerving, his words echoing in my ears. But I had put distance between myself and the woods. It should have been enough, a break from the tension. But even as I approached the cabin, something inside me was unsettled, like a low hum of anticipation or anxiety. I parked the truck and stepped out, the cool air biting at my skin as I made my way up to the cabin door. The familiar sight of the small wooden building, with its faded paint and worn shingles, should have brought me comfort. It should have felt like a sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the day could be left behind, even if only for a moment. But instead, a knot formed in the pit of my stomach. There was something wrong. It was like a feeling you get when you know someone is watching you. But when you turn, there's nothing there. I approached the door, my mind still racing through the events of the morning. It was only a moment before I reached for the door handle, and that's when I noticed it. The door was unlocked. I froze. Now I knew I had locked it when I left. I was sure of it. I always locked the door. The owner had specifically told me to make sure everything was secure before I went out into the woods. So why was it unlocked? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as I stood there for a moment trying to make sense of it. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I had somehow forgotten to lock it before I left. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the door as if expecting it to reveal its secrets. But there was nothing. It remained still, silent, as if it too was waiting for something. It felt like time was stretching in that moment, each second hanging like a heavy weight in the air. I reached for the handle again, and with a steady breath, I pushed the door open. The first thing that hit me was the silence. It was an uncomfortable kind of quiet, the kind that makes your ears ring. The cabin should have been warm. After all, the heat had been left on for me when I arrived, and I had made sure the thermostat was set before leaving. But now, it felt cold inside, like the warmth had been drained from the place, replaced by an eerie chill that seemed to settle into the walls. My eyes scanned the interior as I stepped in, and that's when I noticed the second thing that didn't feel right. Something was out of place. The furniture was where I remembered it being. The small kitchen counter neatly arranged, but there were subtle changes. The pillows on the couch weren't in their usual spots. The chairs, which I had left pushed in against the table, were now pulled out slightly, as if someone had been sitting there. And my bags, which I had carefully packed and placed in the bedroom, were now opened. The zipper on one of them was undone, a detail I distinctly remembered securing. But now it was open, and my clothes and gear were partially spilled out across the bed. I felt a sudden surge of anxiety. Could it be that I had simply left everything in a rush? Could I have been so distracted that I hadn't noticed these things before? The more I tried to reason with myself, the more I felt the panic rising in my chest. No, something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. I walked through the cabin quickly, checking the other rooms. The air felt heavier with each step, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for me to uncover whatever it was that had been disturbed. I found nothing of obvious value missing, but the strange feeling persisted. I paused in the kitchen, my hands gripping the edge of the counter as I tried to steady myself. My breath came quicker now, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. This wasn't just a matter of a door left unlocked or a bag left unzipped. It was the overwhelming sensation that something had invaded my space, something or someone had been here while I was gone. The coldness of the cabin seemed to press in on me as I stood there, trying to make sense of everything. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I felt foolish, like I was overreacting. What if there was a reasonable explanation? What if I had just overlooked something? But the unsettling feeling that had been building in the pit of my stomach refused to let go. I was alone in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor, and the one person I had spoken to, an unfamiliar, unnerving figure, was still fresh in my mind. The weight of the silence was oppressive, and the more I tried to make sense of it, the more I felt like I was spiraling into something deeper, something I couldn't control. I walked into the bedroom and stood in front of the open bag, my mind racing. The zipper on my pack had been undone. There was no question about it. I was certain I had secured it before I left. My eyes scanned the bed, the scattered contents of my bag, and the faint smell of something unfamiliar in the air. It wasn't unpleasant, but it wasn't familiar either. It felt off. My stomach twisted as I thought about the possibility of someone being in the cabin while I was gone. The man from earlier, had he been here? Had he somehow gotten in, searched through my things? I couldn't shake the thought. It seemed absurd, but the more I considered it, the more plausible it became. My mind raced as I considered what to do next. Should I leave? Should I go back to my truck and drive into town? Should I wait and hope that whatever had caused this disturbance would go away? But something told me I couldn't just ignore it. The air in the cabin was too heavy, the silence too deep. I needed to figure out what had happened. I needed to know if someone had been here or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I made a decision. I couldn't stay inside anymore, feeling like a stranger in my own space. I needed to get outside, to breathe the fresh air, to clear my head. I grabbed my rifle, just in case, and stepped back outside. The cold air hit me like a slap, and for a moment, I just stood there on the porch, looking out into the woods. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their dark branches reaching up to the sky. Everything looked normal. The woods were still, but I knew better. I couldn't trust my surroundings. Not anymore. I walked around the cabin, checking the perimeter, my eyes scanning every shadow. The woods were deep, their secrets hidden in the dark corners of the forest. I knew they were vast, untamed, and unpredictable. And now, I felt like I had been reminded of that in the worst way possible. The unsettling feeling remained, like a shadow that followed me wherever I went, a constant reminder that something had been disturbed, something had shifted in the quiet of the woods. I wanted to believe that it was just my imagination. I wanted to believe that I had somehow left the door unlocked and that I had overreacted. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Something had happened in that cabin, something that I couldn't explain. And until I figured out what it was, the woods would never feel the same again. As I stood there in the silence, I realized that the wilderness, once a place of peace and solitude, had now become a place of uncertainty and unease. And it wasn't just the cabin that had changed. It was me. Something inside me had shifted, and I knew that I would never look at the woods the same way again. It's strange how the wilderness, a place that once offered me so much peace, can turn into something entirely different. What was meant to be a retreat, an escape from the noise of the world, suddenly became a place where the air itself seemed thick with tension. The hunt, once a source of solace and contemplation, now felt like a battle, not just with the elements or the creatures of the woods, but with my own mounting fears. The unsettling events of the day, the unlocked door, the sense of being watched, the inexplicable disturbances in the cabin had shattered the calm I had come here to find. The wilderness that had always felt like a sanctuary now felt like a labyrinth, twisting in on itself, threatening to overwhelm me. But there I was, standing at the edge of something much larger than I could ever have anticipated, trying to hold on to whatever fragments of control I could muster. I knew that the only way to reclaim my sense of peace was to face it head on, to go back into the woods, to confront whatever it was that had been gnawing at my mind all day. The strange, unsettling encounter with the man from the woods had left a scar, but it wasn't just his presence that unnerved me. It was the realization that something out there had shifted, something I couldn't explain, something I didn't understand. And the only way to make sense of it was to confront it, to walk back into the unknown. As the evening crept upon me, I found myself preparing for the night's hunt, even though every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave. The shadows in the forest grew longer, and the sky turned an unsettling shade of purple, the sun dipping lower into the horizon. The very landscape had transformed before my eyes, from a place of refuge into a vast, unfamiliar wilderness that felt like it was closing in around me. But I had made a commitment to myself, to this journey, and I was not going to let fear dictate my actions. I would face it. I would find a way to push through. I grabbed my rifle, checked the gear I had meticulously packed earlier, and began my walk back into the woods. The familiar path, the one I had taken so many times before, now felt foreign. Each step was heavy, not because of the weight of my pack or the cold biting at my skin, but because of the weight of doubt that had settled in my chest. The trees, once comforting in their tall, protective forms, now felt menacing, looming over me as if they were silently watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot or the rustle of leaves in the wind. It was as though the woods themselves were holding their breath, anticipating something, waiting for me to make the wrong move. The first few moments were the hardest. Every step forward felt like a step into deeper unknowns, and my mind began to play tricks on me. The wind, which once sounded soothing, now carried whispers, sharp and indistinct, like voices too far away to understand. I caught myself looking over my shoulder more than once, expecting to see someone following me, or worse, someone lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the empty, unsettling wilderness, stretching out before me, stretching out for miles and miles. The paranoia gnawed at me, biting at the edges of my resolve. But I kept moving. I found a place to settle, just like before, behind the blowdown where I had spent hours waiting for deer to cross my path. But this time, it wasn't just about waiting for the animals. It was about waiting for the next step, the next decision I had to make. My hands were trembling as I adjusted my rifle, but I told myself to stay still, to be calm. I told myself that everything I had learned, everything that had brought me to this point, was in me. The skills, the patience, the ability to read the forest. Those things hadn't changed, and neither should I. The fear was only in my mind, I reasoned, and if I let it consume me, it would win. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. The woods felt different. The silence that had once comforted me now felt like an accusation. The familiar crunch of leaves underfoot sounded louder, more intrusive, like every step I took was betraying me, drawing unwanted attention. Even the air seemed heavier, colder. It wasn't just the encroaching darkness, it was the sense that something was there, just beyond my reach, waiting for me to slip up. I tried to focus, telling myself that I was here to hunt, to experience nature as it was, raw and untamed. The thoughts of the cabin, of the man, of the unsettling feeling that had crept into my soul all day, I pushed them aside. But they wouldn't stay buried. They kept rising to the surface, like bubbles in water, forcing their way into my mind, demanding attention. What if the man had been more than just an eccentric wanderer? What if he had known something about this place that I didn't? What if he had been watching me for a reason, waiting for me to venture too far? The questions kept swirling in my head, and soon they consumed all my thoughts. My heart began to race as the wind picked up, its cold breath cutting through my jacket, sending a chill down my spine. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, and once again I found myself looking over my shoulder. This time, I wasn't just worried about a passerby or an animal. This time, I feared something far darker. The shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, and for the first time, I realized how isolated I truly was. It was then that I heard it. A soft, barely perceptible sound, footsteps. But not just any footsteps. These were measured, deliberate, as if someone were walking toward me with a purpose. My pulse quickened, and for a moment my mind screamed at me to run, to get up and flee, to leave the woods, to leave the fear behind. But I didn't. I stayed where I was, my hand tightening around the rifle. It was strange how, even in the midst of panic, I found a sense of calm. It was almost as if the decision had been made for me. I had to stay. I had to face whatever it was that was out there. I scanned the trees, trying to peer through the growing shadows. My breath was shallow, my heart thundering in my chest, but I forced myself to stay still. Every instinct screamed for action. Run, hide, make a sound, anything. But I didn't. I remained quiet, watching, waiting, listening. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, they stopped. The silence returned, deep and suffocating. I felt like I was trapped in a moment of suspended time, my mind racing, my body frozen. I was no longer sure if the footsteps had been real or if my mind had simply conjured them, but deep down I knew. I had to face this. The fear was a test of my strength, of my resolve, and the only way to survive it was to confront it head on. I could run, yes, but I knew it wouldn't end there. I could leave the woods and never come back, but that wouldn't stop the fear from following me. The only way to overcome it was to stand my ground. In that moment, I realized something crucial. Fear, like everything else in the wilderness, is a part of the experience. It's not something that can be avoided, nor is it something that can be defeated outright, but it is something that can be faced. The true test isn't about the absence of fear, it's about how you respond to it. It's about the strength to stand tall, even when the darkness seems to stretch endlessly in front of you. It's about the courage to keep moving, even when every step feels like it might be your last. The night grew darker, but something inside me shifted. The fear was still there, still hovering just beneath the surface, but I no longer allowed it to control me. I was in the woods, and the woods would do what the woods always did, remain wild, unpredictable, and free. But I too was free. Free to stand my ground, free to decide how I would face the challenges that lay ahead. As the hours passed, I eventually made my way back to the cabin, the weight of the night still heavy on my shoulders. But I felt different. The fear had not disappeared, but it had transformed. I had faced it, and in doing so, I had reclaimed my sense of self, my sense of control. The wilderness, in all its vastness and mystery, was still the same, but I was no longer the same man who had first stepped into the woods. I had learned something about myself, something I could never have learned if I hadn't faced my fears head on. The journey wasn't over. There were still many unknowns ahead, many more tests to face. But I knew, without a doubt, that I was ready. As I reflect on the events of that trip, I realize that the lessons I learned go far beyond the immediate experience of being in the woods. What began as a simple hunting trip turned into something far more profound, an exploration not just of the wilderness, but of the inner strength we all have to summon when we're faced with the unknown. The true challenge wasn't in tracking game or braving the cold, it was in confronting the fears that lurk in the corners of our minds and finding the courage to keep moving forward, even when every instinct tells us to turn back. The first and most important lesson I learned was that the wilderness, much like life itself, is unpredictable. No matter how well prepared we think we are, there will always be things that are beyond our control. The cabin door left unlocked, the sudden encounter with the stranger, the eerie feeling of being watched. Each of these moments tested my resolve. But these challenges also reminded me of the true meaning of preparedness. It's not just about having the right tools or knowing the terrain. It's about being ready for whatever life throws at you. It's about staying calm when fear threatens to take hold, and knowing that even when things go wrong, you have the ability to face them head on. Another lesson that stood out to me was the importance of mental toughness. In the wild, the physical challenges are only half the battle. The other half is in your mind. The woods teach you that true strength doesn't come from how much you can carry or how far you can walk. It comes from how you manage your fears, your doubts, and your inner turmoil. It's about staying clear-headed in moments of uncertainty and remembering that no matter how dark or frightening things may seem, there is always a way forward. There is always a path, even if it's not immediately visible. But perhaps the most significant lesson I walked away with was this. Fear is not something to avoid, it's something to face. Fear is not a weakness, but a teacher. It's a signal that you are stepping into new territory, challenging your comfort zone, and growing in ways you may not even recognize. Every time I faced my fear, whether it was confronting the man in the woods or returning to the cabin after the unsettling events, I learned something new about myself. I learned that the things that scare us most often hold the keys to our greatest growth. And in facing those fears, we are not just overcoming obstacles, we are unlocking a deeper version of ourselves. As I leave this story behind, I carry these lessons with me, and I hope you too will find something in this narrative that resonates with your own life. Whether you're someone who enjoys the outdoors or simply navigating the challenges of daily life, the lessons here are universal. We all face moments of doubt, fear, and uncertainty, but it's in those moments that our true strength is revealed. It's in those moments that we learn the most about who we are and what we are capable of. So, as we wrap up this journey together, Remember that the greatest adventures are not just found in the wilds of nature, they are found in the wilds of our own hearts and minds. Don't shy away from the challenges you face, whether in nature or in life. Embrace them, face them, and know that every step you take forward, no matter how small, is a victory. If you enjoyed this story and found something meaningful in it, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support not only helps keep the momentum going, but it also fuels the inspiration for creating more content that speaks to the heart of what it means to face life's greatest challenges. Together, we can continue to explore, learn, and grow. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time, stay prepared, stay strong, and never stop facing your fears.